Alright, today is Fun Day Friday. Hooray for corny themes. So let's look at one of the more, say, versatile yet frustrating cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! Summoner of Illusions. Obviously, the first step to building a Summoner of Illusions deck is Summoner of Illusion, so 3 copies of him. Let's read his effect. He's a flip effect. Tribute one other monster to special summon one fusion monster from your extra deck. The fusion monster is destroyed at the end of the turn this effect is activated. After reading his effect, it is important to note that if you set Summoner and it is flipped face up during the damage step, it will still activate its effect because its effect is mandatory. So if you have another monster on the field besides Summoner, you will have to tribute it. One of the most important elements of a Summoner of Illusion deck is field presence. Obviously, Summoner can't tribute himself for his effect, so a monster will be needed, and ideally it should be generally costless. Incidentally, the principal problem of inconsistency with this deck is the idea that winning tends to only occur through the utilization of Summoner's effect. Thus, too much effort is placed into actually getting Summoner on the field and activating his effect. Summoner is a key card in this deck, but should not be the only card that matters. On this note, one of the best cards in the game for maintaining field presence and producing at least some level of costless recursion are both Fire Hand and Ice Hand. The advantage of these cards in this deck is rather obvious. They produce field control, field destruction, and they thin the deck, increasing the probability of drawing Summoner. Another important aspect of the idea of maintaining field presence is to ask what monsters are able to replace themselves after being tributed by Summoner. The 2 monsters that immediately jump to mind are Naturia Cliff and Reborn Tengu. Looking at the 2, if you had to choose between the 2 of them, Reborn Tengu would be preferred because of its higher attack, but fortunately, the way I construct this deck, there's room for both. So 3 copies of Naturia Cliff and 3 copies of Reborn Tengu. Further focusing on the idea of reducing the impact of Summoner's tribute cost, the trap card Chaos Infinity is an effective card for this deck because it can summon from either the deck or the graveyard, as well as act as a quasi-Book of Teo, allowing Summoner's effect to be activated on the same turn it is set. For my personal taste, the Meklord target for Chaos Infinity that I like to run is Meklord Army of Granel, because its level 4 allows it to be normal summoned and set up common rank 4 XZ plays even outside of the combination Summoner. Also, its effect of cutting an opponent's life attack point in half is actually quite useful, allowing it to trade with a 3200 attack monster or outright destroy a monster with less than 3200 attack by itself. This guy can kill like a Leo by himself. Must be noted that I tend not to run Treeborn because I feel that having certain traps and face down spells is important for maximizing the utility of Summoner. And in my experience, Treeborn is kind of a form of trap that a lot of people who try to run this deck fall into, that reduces its ability to actually win consistently. While this deck is designed to win without relying on Summoner of Illusions, its general theme is based on that particular monster, thus speed is important. Normally one should run either 3 copies of Upstart or 3 copies of Pot of Duality to promote deck speed, and due to the special summoning of this deck, Upstart would typically be the better choice. However, in this build, when we look at the variety of monster types in the main deck, we have Beast Warrior, Pyro, Aqua, Spellcaster, Machine, and Rock, as well as even some more different types that will be in the extra deck. The use of Pot of Dichotomy becomes available and actually should be preferred. It should be noted that due to the activation condition of Pot of Dichotomy, 3 is probably kind of a little too inefficient. At least it has been my taste, so I only use 2. The loss of the battle phase due to Pot of Dichotomy, it's a small drawback, but it can be somewhat mitigated by the effects of some of the fusion targets that are summoned by Summoner, along with the more counterattack attributes of this deck. Moving on to the spells, we have the general staples: one Raigeki, one Soul Charge, one Book of Moon, and one Dark Hole. I run Dark Hole because, first off, as stated in my Noble Knights deck design, I have a lot more respect for Dark Hole, I think, than a lot of other people do, and in this deck, you definitely do need the clearing power of Dark Hole. Obviously, in this deck, Book of Moon is more useful than other decks because it still retains its general defensive ability, but it can also be used to save fusions or reuse Summoner's Effect. On that note, for the purpose of keeping the fusion monster summoned by Summoner's Effect on the field for more than one turn and not just relying on Book of Moon, I like running 2 copies of Forbidden Dress. Being quick play allows its use during either player's turn, and that 600 attack loss typically isn't debilitating to the fusion monster that you're summoning, but it can be very helpful as a nice defensive tactic when you're trying to surprise your opponent and you end up destroying one of their monsters as a result of battle instead of the other way around. Finally, I run 2 copies of Creature Swap. I find it works really well in this deck. You have Tengu and Cliff. You can swap them, run the stronger newly acquired monster into them, get a special summon of another copy. It works really nice with Summoner. Either you flip Summoner up, expended his effect, give your opponent the worthless Summoner, take his monster, or you can even swap a face down Summoner when your opponent has multiple monsters, then attack into the face down Summoner with the monster you just took. The Summoner flips up, your opponent then has to tribute one of his monsters. Some people might ask, where's the back row removal? I think, for me, Ice Hand and the various fusion monsters provide enough removal potential for this deck. I do run some MSTs in my side deck just in case. Moving on to the traps, I've already mentioned the 3 copies of Chaos Infinity, which produces that automatic tribute fodder. There are kind of some interesting selections for this deck. One of the better long-term protection traps in the game that, for some odd reason, doesn't really receive much play is Scrap-Iron Scarecrow. I think that works really well in this deck, so 3 go in. I think some people argue that Scrap-Iron Scarecrow is bad because it's not chainable and it doesn't remove the attacking monster from the field or neutralize its effect, but the non-chainable argument is foolish because there's a lot of good traps in the game that aren't chainable, and with this type of deck, in my experience, Scrap-Iron Scarecrow is going to allow you to control the flow of the duel a little more, activate Summoner on your own terms, and for me, it frequently negates thousands of life points of damage. So, obviously, we run some of the general staples: 1 Torrential Tribute, 1 Bottomless Trap Hole, 1 Ring of Destruction, and 1 Solemn Warning. For the final traps, I use 2 copies of Burst Rebirth. It adds significant utility to this deck, allowing Summoner to be special summoned during the opponent's end phase to set up a tribute play next turn, or you can summon a Fire or Ice Hand for suicide and field removals if you need to. And finally, I run 2 copies of Fiendish Chain to stop any negative summoning cascades or boss-type monsters from the opponent. While most of the time I tend not to cover extra decks because the same type of cards are typically run in them, Summoner decks, obviously we have to have some extra deck discussion. The best card for the Summoner deck is, in my opinion, is Gaia Drake. I run 2 copies of him because it can protect itself from Summoner's destruction effect without any backup from a Book of Moon or a Forbidden Dress, as well as being it's a 3500 attack point monster that can shrug off other monster effects. And in this kind of era of Yu-Gi-Oh, monster effects are seemingly what tend to dominate more than spell or trap card effects. Besides, Gaia Drake, I like the variety of my extra decks, so I have 1 Naturia Exterio for effect negation, 1 Barbaroid for multiple monster destruction and some burn damage, 1 Cyber End Dragon for the piercing damage and just sheer attack power, 1 Destiny End Dragoon, you get monster destruction, burn damage, 1 Gatling Dragon because large-scale face-up destruction, 1 Bloom Diva, monster destruction and damage, and it's kind of annoying to remove a Bloom Diva from the field, and I run 1 Blaze Fenix. Finally, I think we have to add in those 4 staple rank 4 XZ monsters, Exciton Knight, number 101, Castel, Rebellion Dragon, and I also run Anti-Luminescent Knight and Gaia Cowboy. I think it has to be addressed that on a side note, I'm not really a fan of Mound of the Bound Creator in this deck because it's more often than not a dead draw, and this deck can really ill afford dead draws. Also, while both Sphere of Chaos and Koang Noma, the Sybil, can search out Summoner of Illusions, I find both these cards tend to hurt the overall utility of the deck, focusing too much on just getting Summoner out. So, this is my Summoner of Illusions deck. I find this deck somewhat competitive against most of the non-Tier 1 decks. The thing with this deck is that for those who play it, they'll find that they'll get a number of wins when they didn't even use Summoners of Effect at all. And as I mentioned above, I think that's fine because what you would call pure Summoner of Illusion decks, where they're designed just for high consistency play of Summoner of Illusions, they tend to be very inconsistent and lose frequently. So, overall, there are few single card specific decks that succeed when they're focusing solely on that card. Winning consistency with less innately powerful decks requires versatility. So with that, thank you for your attention and your time. I'm out.